For today's video, I want to do something a little bit differently, which is to follow up on the green hashtag scarf, then cover how I adapted the pattern draft for a new project, and then show you how I'm warping the loom from back to front. So this is, sorry about that, too much stuff and not enough places to put it. This is the green hashtag scarf after it went through the wet finishing process. So as you may recall, uh, I was wet finishing it by soaking it in a cool bath with just a little bit of dish soap or wool wash. Soaked it for about half an hour so it would be really, really wet. Then I rolled it in an old towel and let it sit for half an hour so that the towel would soak up the excess water and also be damp. And then it spent 10 minutes in the dryer. I had already twisted the fringe. And the resulting fabric, and I checked the dryer studiously every 5 minutes, and 10 minutes turned out to be just exactly perfect. You may recall, if you compare this to last week's video, uh, that initially the floats had been loose, and I mean really super loose. I kept snagging them on things as I was maneuvering around my kitchen counter trying to get the fringe twisted. And the wet finishing, the fulling process will has greatly reduced this problem. I'm in fact really pleased that things shrunk up as well as they did, and of course this was only possible because I was using a non-superwash wool. The fulling process also reduced the size of the scarf to a more manageable level. The initial project was 8 inches wide by about 72 inches long, which is a good size for a scarf. If scarves get too wide, they're more like shawls and they're not as comfortable. They're too bulky to wear around the neck. And if they're too long, they actually become hazardous in an Isadora Duncan kind of way. Uh, when I took this project off, it was 14 inches wide in the reed. And so it was about 14 inches wide, maybe 13 and a half when it came off the loom, because I was really careful about my selvages. And it was 81 inches in woven length, excluding the fringe. After finishing, it's now about 71 inches long, excluding the fringe, and it's about 10 3/4 inches wide, which is much more manageable a size. I think that it's going to be much more wearable now at this size. And everything I had hoped for came to pass in this project, which is that because the two colors of warp and weft are so similar, the texture stands out. There can only be, as I heard knitting maven Marie Green put it, there can only be one lead singer in the band. And she's absolutely right. When you try to mix texture and color, the color is going to take over, which is, of course, what we saw when I tried to use multicolors or even black as my weft yarn. But the fact that I'm using two really similar colors just added there's a little bit of texture even in the plain weave areas because the warp was hand spun, and that just adds character to these lovely hashtag motifs. And then I thought to myself, remember that red and white yarn, hand spun yarn, or red, brown, and white hand spun multicolor yarn, and natural cream yarn that I wanted to weave into a scarf for my nephew. Well, a hashtag pattern that this time paid attention to the color seemed like the perfect opportunity. So, just as I had mentioned in last week's video, I rewrote the pattern. Actually, first I didn't rewrite it, I just copied it down, but planned that the hashtaggy motifs would be in the colors and the plain weave parts would be in the solid white. And at 24 ends, at 8 in the repeat, uh, repeated 5 times. And I wanted to repeat it 5 times because there's a reason, a design reason people often choose or gravitate toward odd numbers as opposed to even numbers, especially in a striped pattern. The symmetry and the fact that there's a central motif just is really, really pleasing. So this was going to give me 136 ends, and the scarf off the loom was going to be 17 inches wide, really much more like a shawl. So then I did it again. And this time, instead of 6 threads crossing over 6, I chose to do 4 threads crossing over 4. And lo and behold, that gave me the exact same thread count, warp end count, as on the original pattern as on the green scarf. So this meant I was going to have a project that off the loom was about 14 inches wide, and I am mildly nervous about running out of yarn, but we'll see how that goes in a second. And but for warping, it was piece of cake. So I am in the middle of warping my loom from back to front, and I want to talk now about what it means to work with stretchy yarns when you're warping. So the first thing to understand about stretchy yarns when you're warping is how careful you need to be at the warping board not to stretch the yarn as you're going around the pegs. And that you can achieve most easily by just getting into a rhythm. So you're going to have to imagine I'm at my warping board right now, and imagine that there's a row of pegs uh, on each of the 4 sides of the warping board. The trick to that is to be pulling from your yarn source with in my case, my left hand, my non-dominant hand, and then guiding, but not stretching with my right hand. And of course, everybody does it slightly differently, but what you're looking for is that the yarn is close to, but not sagging as it goes from side to side on the board, and keeping an even tension. And this is where planning to use 2 hands makes a huge difference in the process. It is crucial that whatever else you do with the yarn, make sure that it comes off the yarn source, whether it's a skein or a cone, or in my case, wound cakes, as easily and smoothly as possible without jerking. And to pull off a fair amount of slack before you start winding around the pegs. Otherwise, you run the risk of um, some ends being tighter than others, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this is a stretchy yarn. This is a really stretchy yarn. It's so I'm needing to keep it under control as much as possible in the warp as I'm making the warp chains, and then I need to keep it under control as much as possible in the warping process. So from here, you can see how I set up my rattle, and I've already got the warp chains rough slayed in the rattle, and they are at 8 ends per inch, which is what the rattle's doing is spreading my warp yarn to be the width I want my weaving width to be. Uh, because if everything all bunches up on the warp beam and over the back beam, I'm going to have a much harder time getting an even tension across the whole width of the warp. So I've got my rattle set up, and I've got my lease sticks going through the cross, and I've got them tied to the loom or slung from the loom so that they hold on in place with string, and I've got them secured. You can see the cross right there. It's impossible to miss. I've got one leaf stick going in the back, one going in the front, and then I've just got these silly little office supplies, these binder rings, holding them together. And that's what it looks like from the back. Now, don't get seasick. You can see what I'm doing at the front. I've got a space cleared in the shafts for the yarn to just go over through the shafts, but not through the heddles, because this is a handspun yarn, and I want it to be as soft and fluffy as possible so it didn't have a hard finish, and I want it to stay soft and fluffy. And then I've just got 2 exercise weights sitting here. Sorry about the cat puke. There's no way to clean it off here. I've got the ends of the chains threaded through the tops of these sport weights just to add a little more tension to the warp chains. As the great professional weaver Laura Fry says, a string under tension is a string under control. And she's absolutely right. So again, let me show you. All I did was set these weights down, and then I ran one end of the chain through that little hand-holdy loop on the weight. And what this is doing, or it's going to stop doing it in a second, but what this is doing is just adding a little bit more tension. And then the least sticks are adding more tension at the back. And as I said, this is going to stop working in a second. I'm going to need to get my loom bench back in the place. And as the ends of the warp chains get up to about the level of my trap, and then I'm going to have to set everything on the bench. So I'm going to go back to the warp beam crank handle, so you won't be able to see me or see what's happening, and then I will continue beaming the warp, and then we'll be ready for threading. And you can see that because I ran the ends of the chain back over the little hand holding loops on my weights, it started to pull the whole thing backwards. So I'm going to just not even bother doing that. You don't need a lot of tension. You just need enough to kind of keep everybody under control. And now we can see that my hand weights are just about to stop working. So I'm going to finish that up and we'll take it from there. Okay, so now I'm ready to thread the heddles on the loom. And before I'm not going to demonstrate doing that, I want to just show you the anatomy of what's happening. So you can see when I wiggle the warp chains where the least sticks are, and they're what's going to help me thread by following the cross and going in order. They're going to keep all my yarns straight, and I'm not going to take them out. I am, before I tie on at the front, going to take the rattle off the very back of the loom because I don't want that on there while I'm trying to weave off the warp. So I will, I've also got a handy little gizmo that unfortunately I can't show you easily once it's on the loom because it's hard to get a good angle. But if it might look to you, it should look to you as though the top heddle bars of each shaft are going up at an incline, and they are, because I've got this handy little gizmo that I can set inside the castle underneath the shafts to angle them, and it just makes it so much easier to make sure that I am on the correct shaft as I thread the heddles. So I'll thread the heddles, remove the rattle, tie on at the front, tension my warp, weave a header, and then I'm going to be off and weaving. And so future videos will show how this looks like. Oh, also this is super, super fast. I wound these warp chains in maybe an hour. It's going to take, I'm going to say, an hour to thread the heddles. So the whole warping process might take no more than 3-4 hours tops. So that's it for now.